Obviously, it will be difficult, but I want to make it clear that we must combine an awareness of toxic chemicals as well as EMF in order to understand public health and environmental impacts. And the work that we have been doing at Environmental Health Trust is now bringing together research on chemicals and research on environmental electromagnetic radiation. Now, I'm going to talk just about a few studies because, of course, I don't have much time, but I'm going to expand on what I think are some theoretical justifications for there being a link. The next slide will show you that there are many different characteristics of waves that we need to take into account. And often we are told that studies are negative or inconclusive. And I think it's very important to understand that there are many different components of electromagnetic radiation that we have to take into account. And in studies that fail to do this, we're not differentiating between frequency, amplitude, pulse, intensity, or information content. And the point of these slides is to make it clear that the biological impact will vary depending on different qualities of the signals. Igor Belyaev has done brilliant work making this rather clear. The next slide. Just to say that when you hear about negative studies, often they are not studying the same thing. For example, we know that exposure to the human brain can alter glucose metabolism in the brain. And that study was done with 30 minutes of exposure. Other studies done with 6 minutes of exposure, looking at a different tissue, find no such effect. So the absence of a standard metric for studying electromagnetic fields is a huge problem. And I want to say that I'm calling on all of our colleagues to agree on developing an open standard metric for evaluating electromagnetic fields, because without that, we're literally comparing apples and bicycles. And until we have a standard metric for evaluating electromagnetic fields, we will not be able to make progress in terms of research and understanding. In addition, in studies that are done, we have to take into account the age of the cells, the host status, meaning nutritional status, the underlying health, and other components. Often these are not taken into account. For example, you cannot compare work with neuronal stem cells and work with adult lymphocytes. They are fundamentally different. The impact of radiation and chemicals depends on many different components which we have not often differentiated. Next slide.
Next slide.
Next slide, please. Is there a problem?
Philippe, next slide.
All right. Well, let me just say that what I was going to show you is just within a 4-second phone call, there is a tremendous variation in power density. And that, if you'll click here now, click about 5 or 6 times, you will see the huge change in power density in a 4-second phone call. This was provided to Environmental Health Trust by Lucas Margaritis of the University of Athens. And what it shows, you must click several times now. Please keep clicking. Yes, keep clicking. Keep going. You will see that it's the change when you're in standby mode versus answering the phone. It's the change in volts per meter, which we believe is the most biologically important component. Please keep clicking. All right? And the worst time to hold a cell phone right next to the head is when you answer, because it's programmed to go to max power. Now, if studies don't standardize this exposure, then they can get very different results. And it's important to understand that it's the cumulative exposure to the change in volts per meter that we believe is biologically important. So the peaks may be far more important than the average. Go to the next slide, please. Now, we know that vulnerability to a toxic insult depends on the rate of cell growth. The faster cells are growing, the more vulnerable they are. If they lack myelin, as young brain cells do, then they're going to be much more vulnerable than if they are mature. Thinner membranes are more vulnerable to mistakes, whether from chemicals or electromagnetic fields. Next. I want to show you briefly the summary of several different studies conducted in different national institutions. These specific results come from Sir John Aitken at Australia's National Centre for Research in this field. But similar data have been developed in the Cleveland Clinic in the United States. They took test tubes of sperm from human men, not from animals, and the next slide will show you the results. The test tube that was exposed has 3 times more damage to their DNA, seen in the bottom left, and a reduced sperm count, seen in the top left, and reduced motility, seen in the top right. This is just after 2 hours of exposure to cell phone radiation. Now, of course, sperm will normally die, but these sperm died 3 times more if they were exposed to cell phone radiation. And these are human sperm, and there are many replications of this finding. It's a very important finding. Now, we know from other studies that chemicals also have a tremendous effect on mitochondrial DNA of sperm. We know that sperm are very vulnerable, and while it only takes 1 to make a healthy baby, of course, that should be the healthiest sperm possible. And the combination of EMF and chemicals can, in fact, affect sperm in a very negative way. Next. Now, this is a rather complex figure, but if you look at the top, you will see that both cell phones and toxic chemicals can affect either the structure of DNA on the right, going down on the right side of the figure, causing direct DNA damage, or can affect calcium efflux, seen on the left side, having effects on all kinds of enzymes and proteins that can in turn affect repair in heat shock proteins, etc. Now, this particular diagram was developed by the group at the Cleveland Clinic, but I believe it can be generalized to other phenomena than sperm, because what we see here is that you can have effects on structure of DNA or effects on its function. And particularly, we believe effects are great on DNA repair. And if you affect DNA repair, then you are having a huge impact on biological function. Next slide. This is a more detailed view of what happens to sperm alone. And you can see through, again, this is the work done, I believe this was also from the Cleveland Clinic, showing effects on gap junction. Now, we know from work done with PCBs that gap junction cell communication is very important to cell repair. This is showing you in a schematic how electromagnetic fields can also affect gap junctions, and therefore you would expect an effect on DNA repair. And we believe that the new work on epigenetics really should bring our attention more and more to DNA repair. Next. This is the good news, so to speak. There is evidence that melatonin can protect against radiation damage. Now, melatonin is what we make at night, and it is a powerful antioxidant affecting almost every cell of the body, and it's what we do when we sleep in the dark to repair damage that may have happened. This slide shows you that the control cells will have very, very low amounts of damage, and that cells exposed to both melatonin and EMF have significantly less damage. The same is true for chemical exposure. So this is an important indication that we can find protection from other chemical exposures. Melatonin, in this case, is something the body makes naturally, but melatonin is also in clinical trials now at several cancer institutes around the world as a treatment for breast cancer, for example. Of course, melatonin, if it's used, has got to be taken at night because it is very powerful in inducing sleep. Next slide. I just summarized here a number of chemical antioxidants that have been shown to be very powerful and have a protective effect against either chemical or electromagnetic field damage. And I believe this is evidence that we must pay attention to, because it's telling us that it's the interaction between electromagnetic fields and the nutrition and the environment in which we live that make a huge difference for health. And this is just a list I started about more than 25 years ago. I published a series of articles on natural anti-carcinogens, and now I would add that these natural anti-carcinogens found in green vegetables and yellow vegetables and fruits and vegetables with color, among other things, these are very powerful antioxidants and can provide protection from some of the damage that we know that is induced by chemical or electromagnetic field. Next. So what we have is some speculation that what could be involved here is an alteration of calcium homeostasis, and that you have an effect where you're weakening membranes, and as a result, this weakening of membranes is having a major effect on our ability to function and to live in a healthy way. So what I would say, and just give me a moment, I'm trying to find my slide here as I'm talking with you, is that we have good reasons for believing that altered homeostasis, and in fact calcium transport itself, is the most critical thing that is involved in explaining what is going on with respect to the mechanisms of damage. We have altered homeostasis due to the low frequency of electromagnetic fields can lead to plasma membrane weakening. And this takes the negatively charged bilayer of cell membranes and allows potentially other toxic chemicals then to enter the cell. So calcium helps to stabilize and strengthen cell membranes, and things that weaken that can enhance the uptake of toxic chemicals. I think I would thank the people whose work I am showing you here today, including some of the work that Environmental Health Trust is carrying out with our collaborators in Brazil. And as to how to protect your family, we have materials online at our website, ehtrust.org, and those materials are now being widely used by some of our colleagues and institutions in France and Finland, as well as India. And India now has a national policy calling for embossing on the device, information about safe use. So what I would ask your help on is the following. On May 12th, the Berkeley City Council passed an ordinance requiring that people be told if there is information about safe use of a device. And that ordinance stipulates that where information exists, inside the operating system or in a fine print warning, that information must be made publicly accessible at the point of sale. It doesn't tell you that there's a health problem. It simply says, if there's information about a safe distance, it must be made publicly available. We, Environmental Health Trust, are working with Joel Moskowitz and many citizens in Berkeley and town council to see that this ordinance be adopted around the world. And I would like your help in promoting and generating support for this campaign for safer